Well, good morning. I'm Pastor Joey, and it's great to welcome you here at Stones Hill Community Church this morning. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you hear something and you say, wait, what? You ever had a moment like that? I had some of those moments here just in the last week. I knew Pastor Bill Parks wasn't that in that good of health, but when we get the text, or the message, hey, Bill has died, it's a, wait, what? Moment. Just had one this morning. Joe Hutzel comes to church and says, hey, Jackie was sitting in a car in Indianapolis and a bullet goes through the window and fractures, and she's sprayed with some of the fragments of the bullets, but she's okay. And you just kind of back up and you say, wait, what? And sometimes maybe I'll share news with my family. Maybe Megan in Kansas City. Hey, guess who got married? JJ got married. Wait, what? Little JJ got married? Yeah, JJ got married. You ever have a wait, what moment? Well, we have that in the text this morning. It's a wait, what moment for a guy by the name of Abram, whose name was changed later to Abraham. And it was a very powerful moment in his life. And as we study the story, we understand something of the story, and that is that of all the things that could be said about Abraham, this was the climax of his story in Genesis 22. And he's an older guy. I mean, if God came to a 75-year-old person and said, hey, by the way, I'm going to do something really special through you, and you're going to have a baby son, and he's going to be, you'll be the beginning of a big nation, of many people, many seed. Okay, I'll give you a land, a seed, and a blessing. Abraham probably pulled out his AARP card and said, wait, what? 75? And what's crazy is that not only did this promise come to Abraham at 75 or so, it's another 25 years before this thing is fulfilled. So when Abraham is 99 and Sarai, his wife, is 89 going on 90, then this promise is fulfilled and she conceives and she has a baby boy. And they name him Yitzhak or Isaac. And when Abraham got the news, in fact, Sarah got the news, or Sarai, and she laughed when she heard the news. It was a, wait, what? What did you just say? That we're going to have a baby? That's crazy. Well, as we look at the structure of story, and there's so many things that we could talk about here this morning, but when we look at a typical story structure, we look at the exposition, and when you watch a movie or you read a story, you're going to see characters introduced, and there's going to be an interrelationship formed and conversations that take place, and there's going to be a time and a setting, and you're trying to determine whether or not you're going to like the story or the movie, and they're setting that up for you. And then the story will roll along there, and then there'll be a climax. Everything builds toward the climax of the story where it reaches maximum tension. And then that thing will hopefully come in for a landing in about an hour and a half or so as you're watching this thing unfold. And the French call it the denouement. And maybe some of you have studied art form, story, it's art form, will recognize that French term. It's denouement. Looks like denouement, but it's denouement. It's a brief period of calm that follows the climax of the story. And it's when loose ends are tied up, it's when things are explained, it's when this thing finally gets concluded. Well, what I want to do is something this morning that perhaps will help us really see the impact of this phase of the story. And that is, I want to do what a lot of movies do these days. They will show you the climax of the story at the very beginning. I mean, no sooner have the credits and introductions been made as to who produced this thing, and they're showing you the climax. It's the guy that's, he's going over the cliff, or the conspiracy thing that happens and the guy is assassinated, or the lovers jump off the cliff, or something happens in that movie. That's the climax of the movie, and they throw that at you within seconds of this thing. The curtain's pulling back, and there you have the story. And then they'll back up, then they'll show, and they'll work all the way back up to that moment in that movie where you just saw it at the very beginning. Have you seen that device used, that technique used? It's pretty powerful, isn't it? And I kind of want to do that this morning as I was working through the avalanche of material that's just coming at me, and all the different paths that we can take through the story. I think it's important that we look at a certain aspect of Abraham's story, and then as time permits, having dealt with the climax of the story, of his story, and the climax is in Genesis 22, then we'll go back and we'll look at some of the backstory of how we got there. But when we look at Abraham's story in Genesis 22, we understand we've been talking about an upper story and a lower story. The lower story is the details of our lives that we're filled with doubt. We have confusion, there's trials, there's temptations, there's times when we say, wait, what? What did I just hear? And that's part of the lower story. And sometimes, though, God has a way of working in our details of our stories, and sometimes doing things God's way feels foolish, it feels naive, it feels out of touch with the rest of the world, it doesn't make sense, it's a wait what world kind of world. But we must recognize that in this lower story there's an upper story playing out. And God is at work doing something very, very special. Well, as we focus in, and let me throw the climax of the story at you without giving much of the backstory. Abraham is ascending Mount Moriah. He's had his wait what moment. He's ascending Mount Moriah. He is working himself up to sacrifice his only son Isaac. The firstborn cattle were always sacrificed to God in his day and time. It's how religion was expressed. The first fruits of the grain were always sacrificed to God. Sacrificing a firstborn son fit the primitive and ancient pattern of worship. It's what you did. And Abe knew that every family owed a debt. And he knew that the way worship was expressed in those days was that we sacrificed things that were most valuable to us. Yet Abraham's conflicted in his lower story because he knows that God has promised him a son, and he knows that this son has grown up, and this son is probably an early or middle teenager by this point in the story. And he can't figure out, he can't reconcile how this story is going to play out if his son is no longer living. I mean, is God going to raise him from the dead, as Hebrews 11:19 seems to suggest that he believed? We're not sure, and he's not sure. But yet he's trying to be obedient to a voice that he heard. And that is the voice and an appearance from God that he heard. And that is that God has asked him to sacrifice his promised son Isaac. And all of the atheists love this story. All of the agnostic loves this story. All the skeptics love this part of the story. Because it just seems to go in conflict with everything we believe about a good and just and loving God. And maybe you have problems with this part of the story. But every commentator, every analyst, everybody who reads this thing says that the emotional peak, the most poignant spot in the whole narrative, is this fascinating place where the narrator slows down the action And they're going fast in the story. You know, he has a communication from God. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go. And early the next morning, Abraham got up and he saddled his donkey and he took with him. And this thing starts playing out. And then suddenly, in Genesis 22:6, slide number 9, Genesis 22:6, We see the narrative slow down. It's a slow-mo presentation of what transpired. If we could somehow read it with that in mind, we see Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. Don't miss that. All the dangerous stuff Abraham keeps. See the tenderness in the passage. He loves his son. He would not allow the son to carry the knife. He would not allow the son to carry that which would make the fire. All the dangerous stuff he has to carry himself. And as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, and you know, this is the only place in all the Bible where we hear Abraham and Isaac speaking to each other. It's very intimate, a very powerful slow motion scene from the narrator, the writer of the story. Father, yes, my son? The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said. But where's the lamb for the burnt offering? My son, you can't see the lamb. I can't see the lamb. I'm not exactly sure how this thing is going to transpire, but God will provide. You see, God had asked Abraham to do this, to sacrifice his firstborn son, something that they would have done in the pagan religions of the time, in order to set up a dramatic, what I see as apologetic and evangelistic moment. I'll explain it in just a second. Not only was this Abraham's faith proving grounds, it was God making a statement. No more human sacrifice, Abraham. And you're going to bear this message to the world. This dramatic scene marked the end of ceremonial religious murder. God would provide a sacrifice in the future so you can stop killing your firstborn. It was an apologetics moment. And Abraham was to proclaim this message. Most scholars believe that the hill of Moriah is most likely in Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 3:1 talks about this location. It's on the same hill, and I've seen it with my own eyes a couple of years ago. It's on the same hill in the same area, 2,080 years after this Abraham-Isaac episode. God's one and only son would be offered up as a sacrifice on a cross, on a hill in the same place as Moriah. Except on that day, God the Father's Son was hanging on the cross, and the knife was coming down, and there was no ram in the thicket. And there's no intervention. It was God offering His Son, the ultimate and final sacrifice for the world. And Abraham's story prefigures this. It foretells this. And it shows us how God was going to be the one that He Himself would provide the sacrifice. He Himself would provide the rescue and the escape out of the fallen and broken creation that we talked about last week. It's God Himself who interjects, who says to this man, Abraham, I want you to offer your only son Isaac, all the while knowing Abraham was being tested, and all the while knowing He was going to intervene if Abraham would in fact do what He'd asked him to do, and if he was going to be obedient, He was going to intervene and use this as a statement. I mean, imagine the coffee house discussion when Abraham gets to talk about the time when God asked him to do the unthinkable, and He provided a lamb. Imagine what it would have meant Imagine how it impacted communities when Abraham began to proclaim a message to the world that God not only expects us to sacrifice our firstborn sons, no, He Himself is going to provide. We don't have to do this anymore. It was a great apologetics and evangelistic moment that God had set up for him. Yes, it was Abraham's proving ground, his faith proving ground. But it was God making a global statement to the world, to the religions of the world. You know, Carol Kent tells the story of how her son committed murder and it forever changed their lives. And in her book, she titles her book, When I Lay My Isaac Down. And she tells the story of her son, Jason Kent. He loved people. He was a committed Christian. He had a great high school record. He lettered in sports. He was president of the National Honor Society. He was a leader in his church youth group. And as a student at the U.S. Naval Academy, he had earned great grades. He was a disciplined person, but yet on October the 24th, 1999, she gets a call from the police officer, and she has a wait, what? moment. And outside of a restaurant, he had pointed his gun at his wife's ex-husband, whom he suspected was harming his stepdaughters. And he fired multiple shots. And she can't figure this out. Why would a young man with a U.S. Naval Academy education, who had a flawless record, a compassionate heart for other people, with orders from the U.S. Navy to go to the military base in Honolulu, Hawaii, as his first military assignment, why would this young man do something so bizarre? She couldn't figure it out. He was incarcerated. He was beaten up by fellow prisoners. His teeth were broken off. She could do nothing about it. And she talks in her book about laying her Isaac down. She talks about the power of relinquishment. To let go of something or someone that she can no longer control. To let go of a person. To let go of a dream. To let go of an expectation. To let go of a preferred outcome. Jason Kent was her world. And now he's committed murder. And he was given what they call in Florida a toe tag sentence. You don't get out unless you're on a slab. You'll never see freedom again. She said the only thing that kept her afloat was the possibility that God might be doing something in the bigger story of their lives. She realized that there are two different categories of Isaac experiences. Some Isaacs are losses that are thrust upon us, she writes. Terminal disease, infertility, death of a loved one, loss of a position, maybe having a disabled child, maybe a life-altering accident, maybe a financial reversal, maybe a prodigal son, a son that goes rogue, a daughter that goes rogue. Maybe a desire to marry but no prospects. She said that's one kind of an Isaac. These losses that are thrust into our lives. And she said there's another category of Isaac experiences, and they involve personal choices. Letting go of expectations for myself. Giving up a cherished dream for a greater good. Maybe it's addiction recovery. Maybe it's letting a child become an adult. Maybe it's surrendering my ideal life for what I actually have. Maybe it's forgiving someone. Maybe that's an Isaac I need to lay down. Maybe it's embracing God who didn't rescue my hurting child. Maybe it's longing for a more ideal spouse but staying in a difficult marriage. This morning, I think our application question is very clear. And it is, will you lay your Isaac down? Whatever that happens to be. What's the sticking point of your obedience? What is that one thing that you need to lay down before the Lord? It's human instinct to want to clutch things that we adore most. But you can talk to any number of people in this congregation, and they will tell you there will come a time when you're no longer in control. And you have to lay an Isaac down. And when God asks for your Isaac, what will you say? You see, God asked Abraham to leave everything that was familiar to him. He had to leave his nation. He had to put his nation on the altar. He had to put his community on the altar and what he knew and his security and his inheritance and his resources when he left Ur of the Chaldees. He had to leave his family. He had to put it on the altar. And then eventually he'd been putting stuff on the altar all of his life. And eventually this ultimate test comes his way. And God asked him to put his son on the altar. Will you lay your Isaac down as you come up against these in your story? I talked to you last week about some of the things that we look at in our story, and if we were going to tell our story, how we would approach it maybe differently with different things. Maybe we'd start out with where we were born and what our family was like and so on and so forth. If you go in the YouVersion live events today, you're going to see where we talk a little bit about that story and your story. And as we think about applying this and laying down the Isaacs of your life, if someone asked you to tell your story, what would you say? You might start with where you were born and how you were raised. And I'm just going to ask a question right there. Is there something to offer back to God from that experience in your story? Where you were born, where you were raised, how you were raised, what your daddy was like, what your mama was like, what your sibling relationships were like. What's happened in your life story since that time? Is there an Isaac you need to lay down? Maybe you describe your favorite teacher, your first crush, or your first car. Talked to you about this last week. Is there something to offer back to God from these experiences? Your first crush, your first car, your first teacher. Maybe you might include that time that you scored the winning touchdown, or that other time you threw up right before singing your first solo. Is there something to offer back to God from that experience in your story? If you're married, you might describe how you met your spouse. If you're not, you might describe the kind of person you want to marry. Maybe you're a parent and you have kids. Maybe you'd show us pictures on your phone or your tablet. Maybe you'd discuss some things about your family, but maybe, just maybe, there's an Isaac in that part of your story that you still need to lay down. And maybe you have one of those stories where you've got obstacles to overcome. You've survived some challenges. You've accomplished some goals. You haven't been perfect or lived a flawless life, but who has? But is there something in Isaac in your life that you need to lay down in that area of your story, in that part of your story? You see, what if every time we lay down our Isaac, God provided another way? And if He does, then our story and His story are linked together. And so wherever you are on your spiritual journey this morning, I think the climax of Abraham's story is a fitting place for us just to land for a moment and think about how that plays out every day in our lives. And I can tell you as a parent, your hope is that you will raise your kids right. Your hope is that you'll create the environment where they will you present this great argument and proposal for God and who He is and what He's about. And your hope is that someday your kids will buy in and they'll live that out. And that's the hope that you have. And that's what you strive for. But we can see, even in the Abraham story, where things didn't always go as planned. And And there was struggle. And Abraham at one point in his life was an idolater. And we see this from other places. But God broke through his idolatry. And God rescues him from his idolatry and sets him free. And gives him and says, I'm going to call you, Abraham, to do something great, but you're going to have to leave some stuff behind. And that's exactly what we have to do. We have to lay our Isaacs down. We have to put something, we have to walk away from some things. And we have to rise up to the calling that God has called each of us to. And the only way is that we can do this and we can work through our wait what moments of life is to understand that nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is guaranteed, that's for sure, but nothing is impossible with God, and the only guarantee is God himself. Anything is possible, but not everything is promised. And that's why we call it a relationship, and that's why it's a story that plays out every day. Because we don't know what impossible situations are going to step into our lives. We don't know how that's going to play out. And that's why we have to have these moments in our life. And I'm sure Abraham and Isaac, I'm sure as he got the altar ready, I'm sure as he placed those stones and got those stones located just right, and as he laid that wood, he was waiting for the intervention of God at any moment. Is this far enough? Come on, is this far enough? Do something. Just keeps playing out, and he keeps playing out, and he keeps playing out, and he finally's got the dagger. And the angel of the Lord intervenes at that moment and says, okay, put your knife down. I want to teach you something through this. God is going to provide. Don't ever count God out. He will intervene in just the right moment, in just the right way to provide for you. Well, that's the Abrahamic climax. And I don't know what, Isaac, you have to lay down this morning at this stage of the story. And there's a lot of backstory that I'm going to have to go back next week and fill in for you. But I think it's important that we look at this power of relinquishment here this morning, and perhaps there's something you need to walk away from. Perhaps there's something you need to put on an altar today. And you're not sure how it's going to go, and you're not sure what's going to happen. But the great principle is those who see God get away from this consumer mentality that says, I'm going to live life for myself. I'm just going to be concerned about where I live and what culture I'm in and my own safety, and I'm not going to take these uncalculated risks for God. No, I'm not going to do that. Well, we know that those who follow the story of the ages, sometimes the story followers and the storytellers, they hear from God. And they're a story liver. And they don't want to just know the story, they want to live the story. And they get past the questions of what's most comfortable for me, and where do I live that's most comfortable, and what job do I take that's the best fit for me maybe, and best for my comfort and my influence, my status in the world. What we see from the Abraham story is that when we really see God, it jolts us out of that thinking. And we go to this question of, where can I be a blessing? How can I be a blessing to the world? And if you seek to be blessed, you'll be empty. And what we see in Abraham is that if we will obey God, He will bless us. If we seek to fill others up, we will be filled. If we seek to lay our Isaacs down on altar after altar and to commit to a life of obedience when we don't understand, God says, I'm going to use that kind of life. And maybe that's the kind of life you would like to have this morning. It's very simple. To the degree that we're willing to get out, to the degree that we're willing to get uncomfortable, to the degree that we're willing to turn our backs on what we think is a safe place or a comfortable place, God says, I will bless you in order that you may be a blessing. I will appear to you. I'll come into your life in a way that I would never otherwise come into your life. But you have to be willing to launch out in mission. And that's what we're inviting you to do here at Stones Hill, is to get in mission, to get into mission, to hear a God say, I'm sending you out to be a blessing. For us to corporately hear that message. Lay your Isaacs down in your individual lives, and collectively, I will send you out to be a message to the world. Live out the story. That may involve money. That may involve time and resources. But I'm going to bless you if you will lay it all down and make it available. Make your life and the resources of life available. I'll lay it down. I'll use your life. I'll bless your life. Would you pray with me this morning? Thank you, God, for this morning. Thank you for your love and your grace. And thank you for working in our lives. And thank you for being our sustenance and strength. When we had those wait, what moments. And maybe that's where some of us find ourselves here this morning. It's really a life of faith that we have to live. And there's some Isaacs that we're going to have to lay down. And we understand it starts with ourselves and our lives. And then it's going to start with our own kids and our family. We've got to lay down our kids and give them to you. We can't control their lives and all that happens in their lives. We can't control their decisions. We can't control so much in life. And so we just commit our family to you. Sometimes bullets go through windows. Sometimes job assignments are given and they go around the world. Sometimes we find ourselves in hospital rooms and funeral homes. And we can't control it, and it irritates the bejeebies out of us. And it bothers us, and it messes with our heads. But God, we know there's no other way to be blessed. We can't hang on to these Isaacs. We can't. It's going to destroy and disembowel us spiritually. And so I just pray that you would help us to release this morning the Isaacs that are our precious prized possessions. We hang on to those bank accounts because we worked so hard for them. And we hang on to those kids because we parented so hard for them. And we hang on to these jobs because we've invested and divested so much of ourselves into them. We hang on to these relationships because we have so much social capital invested into it. And when we realize the power of disillusionment, and it doesn't materialize the way we want it to, we want to seize our Isaacs. We want to dress this thing up and write it a different story. But we know there is no life there. There is no hope there. There is no assurances there. That when you said, if you'll obey me, I will do these things. I will make you great. And that I wills are just stacked on top of each on the other in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And that's what we need, is the promises of God this morning. So in our attempt to be restored by a bigger and a better story, we understand that really the climax of Abraham's story is also the climax of our stories. Until we have Moriah in front of us, until we have the Isaac laid out, whatever that is, or this person is, we will never thrive. We will never be in a position to be a blessing. We will never be in a position to be a voice of truth to the world in our community as a church family. We will never be in a position to speak hope in all these arenas of life. We will never be able to do it. But when we as individuals lay our Isaacs down, our bank accounts, our relationships, our marriages, our affairs, our sins, our pet sins, our addictions, our faults, our foibles, our failures, only then can the story live in us and through us and powerfully move in our world. And so it is our prayer to be restored by this story. And wherever our life stories take us in this series, and whatever it is we need to lay down, oh God, help us to lay it down in this moment. In this moment. Because our life depends on it. And so we just ask here as we look at this climactic movement in your story of how you're going to build a nation through the obedience of this man. Dealing with the list a little bit more next week, but as we get this climax in front of us, may each of us purpose in our hearts to be obedient this day. In Jesus' name. Can you stand with me? Some of you, I know, are in a moment in your life where you're hanging on to something and you need to lay that thing down or that person down. And I challenge you to do it today. I got a group of guys here, prayer team guys. They'll be willing to pray with you today. And so if you want to come up and pray some after the service, feel free to do that. We'll pray with you here together. You've been a great group. Lay your Isaac down. What do you say? And let's move forward in the story. Have a great day. Don't eat too much taco dip for all these football things happening, okay? And drive safe and be safe. Blessings.